Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Maddie's community conversation. As we're wrapping up our year of community conversations in our last month of June, very happy that you're joining us from wherever you are. So please feel free to put in the chat box where you're joining us from. Oh, and Jenna, excellent announcement. Happy Pride Month to everyone and celebrating our inclusivity and all of our loved ones. So very excited to join you in celebrating that as well. And I am joined by the amazing Miguel Reyes, and he is currently, see if I can get this title right, he is currently the Community Resource Manager for Pasadena Humane Society. His favorite musical is Wicked, and an all-around amazing human. So I'm going to hand it off to Miguel, and let's talk about our question of the day, or questions of the day.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. Quick clarification that it's Wicked the movie. I just don't want to take credit for Wicked the theater because I haven't seen it. But thank you so much. And the question of the day today is, how has a case surrounding finances positively impacted your work? I think that'll be posted in the chat also. And then if y'all are just trying to keep it light today and you also want to let us know what your favorite musical is, please do in the chat.
Sometimes I think these cases that have a financial piece to them are really memorable and super impactful and lead into our discussion that we're going to have today with our guest. This is a very challenging thing to think about, and hopefully an experience we've all had and will have in the future, in the sense that the reality of finances and the work that we do are massively important and challenging, but reaching out in different ways is hopefully going to be something that we can all connect with. I think my favorite musical, again, I would have to clarify, musical as in theater versus in the movies. I really love the Les Mis adaptation for the movie, but I'm not sure that that would match my in-person. I think my in-person favorite musical, or in theater, I should say, is Hadestown, which is an exceptional run. Very much enjoyed that one.
We're getting some responses in the chat too. Chris Holland said, our pet resource center kept the family united when their cat needed antibiotics they couldn't afford. They came to us to surrender, but we provided the medication instead to keep the family united.
Oh, wonderful. A simple solution and a huge impact.
A lot of good musicals in that to check out in the chat too. Well, thank you, everyone. I think we can move on to national announcements. Do we have any national announcements today?
I've got one. I'm wondering if the person who attended for us last week maybe talked about this, but just in case they didn't, we have the online kitten conference coming up this coming weekend at the Community Cats podcast. It's our yearly conference. We do it every year in partnership with the National Kitten Coalition. And it's really, it's a whole 2 days. It's all kitten focused content. And this year we're talking about decision-making for kittens as a TNVR model, FIP. They're talking about different socialization topics, kitten photography, which is super fun. And so much more. So it's going to be a huge weekend, and you can register at communitycatspodcast.com, or recordings are included in that. So if you're not around all weekend, it's not gonna make or break your being able to take it in. So that's what's coming up this weekend.
It's a great conference, super resourceful. I spoke with it last year and then just stayed around to listen to all of the wonderful material. So thank you for that reminder that that's going on, and feel free to post in the chat so we can get a hot link directly for anyone who's listening to be able to register.
Thank you.
Any other national updates or announcements? Let's be quiet as we're running into June.
Yeah.
Summer has come upon us, and kitten season, indeed. Well, reminder for everyone also to feel free to follow the link in the chat for Maddie's Fund monthly giveaways. Easy opportunity to hopefully earn some extra cash for your organization. At this time, I think we're going to transition into our speaker. So very excited to introduce Dr. Valerie Mercado. She is an international speaker. I've seen her all over the world. And she is a graduate from the University of Georgia's Veterinary Medical Scientist Dual Training Program. So she is a DVM PhD and a diplomat of the American College of Poultry Veterinarians. I am very much a fan of her work for a group that she co-founded called Possibilities Vet Med, which is an accessible platform to reshape mentorship and professional development for marginalized veterinary professionals. Amongst a million other things, she is just an all-around great human, and she's been recognized as a veterinarian of note, extraordinary woman in veterinary medicine, and happy to have her join us today to give us a mix of light and heavy here, really important work. So Chip on Your Shoulder, a study of socioeconomic privilege, using Legally Bond, the musical, hence my background. Valerie, welcome, and excited to hear what you've got to share with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you all today. And I assume that now you can see my slides, but if you cannot, just let me know.
Looks great.
Yeah, so I'm not going to talk too much about myself today. I'm going to just go straight in, but I will introduce Possibilities Vet Med briefly, which is the nonprofit that I co-founded. And our goal is to diversify all roles within the veterinary profession by providing resources, mentorship, and professional development opportunities for all intersecting identities, focusing on individuals from historically marginalized communities. So our vision is to build a robust and thriving community that fuels an inclusive profession that then mirrors the diversity of society. So our core values are listed on here, and I'm going to go ahead and move on. So I'm going to go ahead and do some introductions of the different characters. We'll go through different definitions, and then we'll go into access to careers and access to care. In terms of the learning objectives, it would be fantastic if there was, by the end of this talk, an understanding of how socioeconomic privilege affects who joins animal health as a career, as well as the correlation between economic privilege and access to pet care, which I think this is an audience that very much understands that, but also the link between access to care and access to careers in animal health. I am making a few assumptions, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail into things that I think this audience knows, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on access to care, for example. I will cover all of the different connections, but this is a very broad topic with a lot of different areas. And so if there are any particular questions that you have, I'm always happy to go more in depth if we have more time at the end. So let's start with the characters. Hopefully some or most of you have seen the movie and the musical. If you have not, there's a link on YouTube that you can watch. I think I love doing this talk because then I go back and watch it a couple of times. And on this slide is Elle Woods, and in the movie it is portrayed by Reese Witherspoon, and in the play, in the original cast that came onto MTV is Laura Bell Bundy. Sorority girl Elle Woods is a fashion merchandising student. She's a sorority queen. She then gets dumped by her boyfriend, and she follows him to Harvard Law School. So said ex-boyfriend is Warner Huntington III, and in the movie he is played by Matthews Davis, but in the play by Richard Blake. In law school, then Elle meets Emmett. And this is where the movie and the play are going to be a little different. So in the play, in the movie, we have Emmett Richmond, who we don't learn a lot about. And this is part of why we focus on Emmett Forrest, who is the character in the play. In the movie, Emmett Richmond is played by by Luke Wilson, and then in the play, in the original MTV, by Christian Borle. So Emmett Forrest advises Elle while she's in vet school, right? And his socioeconomic background and upbringing is completely different from hers. We focus on these two characters a lot of the time because he says when you're not born into privilege, you have to work twice as hard. This statement is actually the reason I started using this musical and why I use the musical and not the movie. Of note, though, is that socioeconomics are presented in a number of different ways, right? So Paulette, for example, who in the movie is portrayed by Jennifer Coolidge, and then in the play by Orphet, she is another example of socioeconomic differences. She states at one point, honey, I can't talk to guys like that. I'm not like you. I don't have anything to offer. And while we're not going to focus a lot on her, I just want us to keep in mind that one of the things that the musical does very well is show those relationships between different socioeconomic groups. We will focus on Elle and Emmett, right? So we're going to think about how different factors can impact individuals based on their socioeconomic statuses, and then bridge that into socioeconomic privilege. We'll go ahead and, talk about the amount of work that goes into, both of these roles. So Emmett and Elle are the closest comparison, right? Like they're receiving similar educations, they have very close interactions throughout the entire thing. And in order to be able to do that, we have to go into some background and make sure that we're all at the same level. So let's talk about privilege first. So privilege is access or advantages that are granted to specific groups based on specific demographics or social identities. It does not mean that someone did not work hard to get to where they are. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means that they didn't have to face barriers that are faced on their demographics, things like race, ethnicity, religion, gender, and socioeconomic status. Examples of privilege that maybe you don't think about on a daily basis can include growing up in a two-parent household, not needing to get a job for the purpose of income during high school or during college, not having to think about being the only woman or the only person of color in a classroom or in a work meeting. So then from privilege, we also have to introduce socioeconomic status, which encompasses not just income, but also educational attainment, financial security, and even subjective perceptions of someone's social status and social class. Socioeconomic status can encompass, the opportunities that somebody is given. It can impact the privilege that is afforded to different groups in society. And then poverty specifically is not one single factor, but is rather characterized by multiple physical and psychological stressors. Privilege, then, when we bridge into socioeconomic privilege, is the benefit that someone may receive from their standing within a certain socioeconomic group. So again, income, financial security, educational attainment, all of these things play into what socioeconomic privilege is. In the musical, we see that Elle grew up in Malibu. She talks about her neighbors. She is able to go to her dad and say, hey, I want to go to law school, right? She receives money from her dad to go to undergrad, to go to law school. She even got a letter of recommendation from Oprah in the play. And if you haven't seen it, she is dumped on her senior year by Warner and then decides at that point that she wants to go to law school. And her sorority friend, she happens to be the president of Delta Nu, and her sorority friends really support her the entire time. They help her study, they do practice tests with her. So she has a community, right? We see her friends like help her study for the LSAT, and her privilege doesn't mean, again, that she didn't work hard. You can see throughout the play that she's studying a lot. She has a 4.0 GPA in fashion merchandising and a lot of experience in leadership, right? As we see, she is the president of her sorority. They do make a point throughout the musical of highlighting how smart she is in different areas in a way that I didn't feel that they pointed out as well in the movie. Right, so she did face challenges, right? And so socioeconomic privilege led to her connections and led to her community, and it gave her the resources that allowed her to very last minute decide that she wanted to go to Harvard Law and do it. Emmett, on the other hand, says in the musical that he grew up in the Roxbury slums, with his mom. He saw around him a lot of bums that showed him all the ways that men can fail. He worked 2 jobs in addition to class while he was in law school. So we know that he went to he worked a lot. He is from a single parent household and he struggled compared to how Elle did. And that can lead us to, I guess, infer that throughout undergrad, he probably have to do the same. He might even have loans from undergraduate, like schooling and whatnot. So that brings us into differences, right? Which is diversity. So diversity gaps are ones that result from inequity. And that is inequity in access to and to quality of services. So diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging are all these overlapping values that refer to the presence of differences and about creating an environment where everybody feels valued. And all of those things together, diversity, equity, inclusion, then create belonging, which is something that individuals feel from all of those inclusion efforts. So we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, because when individuals have unequal access, they are not afforded the same opportunities, right? Like, duh, we all know that. It's very interesting to see in the play when Emmett says to Elle, didn't your mom teach you about not judging a book by its cover? So he is dressed in secondhand suits. She doesn't think that they fit him as well. She takes him shopping. She buys him a bunch of clothes as a thank you for all the things that he's done for her. And this is the statement that, he makes. And then she says, yes, she did. But I also know the tattered books stay on the shelf. And this is where biases come in, right? So yes, we can be told many a time that we shouldn't be judging others by what they look like and how they dress, etc. But our biases steep in, right? And biases can result in things like stereotypes, discrimination, macroaggressions, systemic discrimination, etc. So we have to be able to talk about these to talk about privilege. Diversity and discrimination refers to unfair treatment of people based on different demographics. And we have to understand that within each of these demographics, there are different challenges, right? So the challenges that religious minorities may face may not be the same ones that racial and ethnic minority groups face. And being able to understand that can help us figure out our own privilege as well. When it comes to discrimination, socioeconomics plays a role, and it impacts, it's kind of the cycle, never-ending cycle, right? Impacts education, employment. There's an environmental component to it: food, healthcare, housing, the justice system, salaries, social services, wealth. And I know we're getting into the little bit of the heavy topic here, but all to say they impact every aspect of how somebody lives. So being able to say, oh yes, it's just socioeconomics, is very simplistic, right? Because we know that systemic discrimination can lead to compromised learning, to depression, to hypertension, to decreased confidence, burnout, anxiety, stress, and all of these other things. They're all well documented in the literature. With socioeconomics, we also have to think about educational aspirations. And I started looking at this topic because I was raised by a mom who is a veterinarian, so I was very privileged to get to see a lot of areas of veterinary medicine, to have a lot of contacts within it, and to see myself represented, which is not something that happens, to everyone. But according to the Committee of Economic Development, when you look at educational aspirations and how they relate to socioeconomic status, individuals from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are much less likely to obtain their bachelor's degree, are more likely to, or are less likely to get high school diploma. And so this is a multi-generational problem that impacts not only who moves from one socioeconomic bracket to another, but it also impacts the education, it impacts the resources of different communities. And this is something that you all know very much about, as many of you are in areas working in animal welfare in some of these lower socioeconomic communities. But why is this? What is this cycle coming from? So according to the American Psychological Association, socioeconomic status can predict a lot of outcomes across somebody's lifespan. This includes physical and psychological health. Children from lower socioeconomic status households and communities develop academic skills slower than those from higher SES groups. The school systems are often under-sourced. This negatively affects the students' academic process and their outcome, right? So The teachers have less experience. They get a lower quality of training. There's lower, library resources, things like that all contribute to continue to that inequality. So career barriers then are significantly higher, not only for those from poor backgrounds, but then once you put in things like people of color and women, people who are disabled, individuals who identify as LGBTQIA+. And while oftentimes when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we talk about race and ethnicity, the reality is that diversity encompasses a lot more, right? Oftentimes we forget to mention, say, people from rural communities who also have higher rates of, or more like their lower income communities. So something to consider, to keep in mind. But prejudice, we talked about biases, right? And this conversation between Elle and Emmett. So not judging a book by its cover. Elle is shown throughout the show to be labeled by others, right? She experiences stereotypes and prejudice for being blonde, for being a woman, for liking the color pink. This isn't necessarily the same as discrimination, right? Prejudice is not discrimination, because discrimination is based on oppression. And oppression, you can't necessarily reduce to just one part of somebody's identity because it has overlapping social identities that relate differently to social structures, right? So social identities work on multiple levels, so they result in very unique experiences and opportunities and in barriers for different individuals. So where does that come in, right? So Elle, again, female, right? Blonde from a higher socioeconomic background compared to Emmett, male, white, from a lower socioeconomic background. So that's part of why I like making this comparison, is because we're focusing on a population where the Elle's privilege is a little lower, right? Because being a woman instead of a man compared to, in the wheel of power versus their socioeconomics. And so there are a lot of different components at play here, and this is an oversimplification of all of that. But Emmett says to us, with the chance I've been given, I'm going to be driven as hell. And as a student from an affluent socioeconomic background, Elle is able to focus on leadership experiences, on studying, and students like Emmett are relying on part-time jobs to aid in their education. In this play in particular, we're looking at law school, right? But in real life, we're looking at associate's degrees at community colleges. We're looking at undergraduate institutions as well as graduate ones. And I like using this example specifically in the veterinary side because it's a similar application process and levels of debt, etc. So I find that people identify a little bit more with it, but the examples do extend to a lot of other populations, right? So why do you care? I know I've thrown a lot of seemingly disconnected ideas, walking through privilege and then socioeconomics and socioeconomic privilege, the impact on education. So how does this connect back to animal health? So it's not unusual that when we talk about animal health, we focus primarily on clinical practice, right? We focus on veterinarians that work with companion animals in clinical practice. I always like to remind everybody that we are all affected by animal health and well-being in so many different ways, right? Through conservation, food production, food safety, the leisure industry, public health, research. If you have a pet, if you care about food safety, if you care about agriculture, if you live in an ecosystem that has wildlife, if you visit a zoo, if you visit an aquarium, if you enjoy watching or participating in activities that include animals, if you benefit from biomedical research, then veterinary medicine and animal health is around you and has touched you. Therefore, that's all of us, right? And yet we only have about 130,000 veterinarians in the US. And I know I'm going into the veterinarian numbers, which is not necessarily my audience today, but those are the numbers I have. So it's what I use as an example. Of those veterinarians, about 82,000 are in clinical practice, right? About 14 to 15,000 are in public or corporate, but then we also have less than 2% Black veterinarians and less than 1% Native people veterinarians, right? So these statistics are from 2023. And I believe they increased by about 3,000 veterinarians each year. But we're talking about the veterinarians that, 130,000 veterinarians total looking at, food safety and animal research and public health, in addition to companion animal medicine. And many of you know, because a lot of these stressors also extend not only to non-veterinarian, vet professionals, but also to animal welfare teams, right? There are a lot of stressors in the profession that come in a multitude of ways. Staffing shortages, right? So recruitment issues, poor retention. Then we have the lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have financial instability in the form of, high levels of debt, terrible debt to income ratio, big salary discrepancies, and high levels of occupational stress then resulting from that. This includes, high emotional stress. It includes high physical stress due to the demands of the job and the nature of the work. We also have barriers to care, which, we're going to go into in just a second, but meaning uneven distribution of care that leads to things like veterinary deserts and then challenges in access to care. And just to go back into some of the inequality and access to the veterinary profession, this is the makeup of, veterinarians, veterinary technicians, vet assistants, and caretakers for 2024, based on the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So again, with less than 130,000 US veterinarians, that means that we don't have a lot of veterinarians from the communities that we wish to represent. And of course, if we were to separate this by socioeconomics as well, we would see great discrepancies in that too. This is because individuals from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to reside in veterinary deserts. In fact, veterinary deserts, one of the ways that we characterize them as such is through the socioeconomics of the area, right? So that means that they may be less likely to be exposed to veterinary medicine, right? To animal health. They may be less likely to see themselves represented in the profession. Individuals from historically marginalized communities report having more difficulty finding people to shadow, receiving less support from mentors. This can ultimately, again, in addition to all of the compounding effects that we already talked about when it comes to socioeconomics, it ultimately impacts, their GPA, their GRE. And this is without even considering whether they can afford things like tutoring or prep courses, whether they have after school programs, etc. So the usual stresses in the veterinary field are there, right? So the financial, the mental, the physical, etc. But then they disproportionately affect people from historically marginalized communities who are also facing discrimination based on being from from rural communities. They're facing sexism, they're facing homophobia, etc., racism, etc. But then, it's on this side. We do know, according to the 2019 American Association of Vet Colleges admissions report, this is from the pool of candidates from 2019 from vet school. Candidates that received admission to veterinary school were more likely to be free of current educational debt. They were less likely to be Pell Grant recipients, which means that they were more likely to be from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, and they were less likely to be first-generation college students. This will come in handy towards the end when I'll just tell you now anyway, but when I repeat towards the end how individuals from these communities are the ones that are most likely to go back and practice in these communities. But the human-animal bond impacts all of us, right? So you saw the different things that discrimination impacts. Now look at the things that the human-animal bond positively impacts, right? So things like allergies and blood pressure, cancer, cardiovascular health, dementia, exercise, happiness, PTSD, self-esteem, social integration, stress relief. It is mutually beneficial between people and animals, as we know, and it's influenced by behaviors that are essential to the mental, the physical, and the social health and well-being of both. And the barriers to care, which I won't go into, actually I will go into a little bit more on the next one. There are a lot of different ways in which we characterize these barriers to care. I usually go with cultural competencies, geographic knowledge, and socioeconomic barriers. And those are actually on both sides. They exist on, the pet owner, they exist as part of society, but they also exist on the side of the animal health team. on cultural competency, things like biases and prejudice, geographic, the availability of service, right? But also the availability of teams, the burnout, the compassion fatigue, the salaries, knowledge, when and where to obtain services, and then socioeconomics with affordability of care, among a lot of other things, right? Pet ownership is increasing, but our veterinary teams are burning out. Access to veterinary care is disproportionately being impacted. And the majority of pet owners report that they have some of these barriers. So what do we do, right? When it comes to caring for these pets, the AVCC report from 2018 actually showed that veterinarians believes, based on whether society has a responsibility to help poor people and their pets, right? So if you look at the overall, that was about 771 veterinarians that were polled, and almost half of them do believe that society has a responsibility to help individuals from lower socioeconomic backgrounds care for their pets. And when you break it down by urban, suburban, and rural communities, it is very interesting to me that that flips the script, with veterinarians that practice in rural communities being less likely to believe that as a society, we have a responsibility to help people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. The other portion of this is the belief of who should own pets, right? So overall, about 60% of the veterinarians that were polled believe that, or disagree that, everyone, regardless of circumstances, should be able to own a pet. Not great, right? But the reality is that people own pets, and there's not much we can do about that, right? So how do we help them care for those pets? So thankfully, even though a big part of the veterinary team believes that not everyone should be able to own pets, a lot do believe that we have a responsibility to help care for them. Now, if we have gaps in veterinary deserts, which are more likely to be in low-income communities, in urban communities as well as rural communities, but those individuals are less likely to be exposed, right? And they're less likely to be exposed both because they don't have access to, veterinarians, but also because they may not have the resources to pursue it as a career. How do we create long-term programs that address access to care? So the imbalanced distribution of health personnel contributes to these disparities, right? In human medicine, and actually in veterinary medicine as well, there's been studies that report that individuals from lower socioeconomic areas are the ones who are most likely to want to practice in those areas. So people are most likely to want to practice medicine in areas similar to which they grew up. Now, it's not everyone, right? But therefore, one thing to do is to invest in individuals who are from those communities being able to achieve that educational path, and helping them when they choose to go back to those communities. I do a lot of work in mentoring, and a lot of what I see in mentoring is pushing people to be at a community that is, socioeconomically better to the one that somebody grew up in. Just saying, oh, if you practice in this area, if you have a clinic in this area, if you do this, you're going to be able to, have clients who are able to afford care. However, it's not great to move individuals from. A lot of individuals want to go back to those communities, and what are we providing, right? One graphic that I didn't include in this is the discrepancies in debt, right? So the average veterinarian is graduating with about $180,000 in debt. And when you break that down by race and ethnicity, veterinarians who are minorities are graduating with significantly higher levels of debt compared to their classmates. So in 2020, Black veterinarians graduated on average with about $260,000 in debt, compared to their classmates who were white, who graduated with $160,000 in debt, right? So we're talking about $100,000 difference. Hispanic and Latino veterinarians, that was on average $50,000 that year. And they've repeated this study in 2021, 22, and 23. And the discrepancies were not as big, but they were still there. So how can we say to someone, hey, you're a veterinarian, I mean, you're interested in veterinary medicine, but you're from a lower socioeconomic background, come into this profession, right? Like you're going to end up with substantially more debt. We may push you to practice in a community where, you may not be able to afford paying back your education, but also you may face different forms of discrimination. So how do we do that, right? So we create these spaces in which people feel that they belong. We provide resources, but we have to start from a place of not bias, right? So when we talk about inclusive spaces, and we'll get back a little bit to the movie, right? We're talking about people feeling that they belong. Regardless of their socioeconomic background, in the movie, we see different, in the musical, we see different areas and different examples of where both Elle and Emmett mentioned that they don't belong. Emmett at one point says, they laughed at me like they're laughing at you, right? So neither of them felt that they belong, and they bonded because Emmett sees the prejudices that Elle is facing, and it makes him think of things that he faced when he was at that point, right? He says, they laughed at me like they're laughing at you, and we can't win if we don't follow through. All right, so being able to work together efficiently, collaborate, can actually increase things like profitability and creativity. We see that throughout the play, right? They're working together, they're using innovative strategies to achieve results. And if any of you remember, there's a whole scene with how Elle refuses to tell everybody Brooke's alibi for, helping her not be charged for murder. And at some point, somebody says, well, I'm trying to save her life. Like, who cares if everybody finds out about her alibi? We're not going to win without the alibi. And she says, well, then I guess we're not very good lawyers, right? So she's bringing everybody out of that mentality. And I know I keep bringing her back as an example that maybe shouldn't be made in terms of like the socioeconomics, right? But at the same time, the only reason she was able to do that is because she has someone like Emmett who had built resilience, right, through a lot of the work that he had to do to get to where he was, and worked with her to get to that point, right? So in veterinary medicine and animal health in general, being able to diversify our services and help address some of these socioeconomic challenges can help in a variety of ways. Things like cultural competency can improve client communication, treatment plans, the comfort levels of clients, right? According to the Harvard Business Review, a team that has a member that shares a client's ethnicity is 150% more likely than another team member to understand that client. So any discrepancies that we have in how our teams reflect our community are missed opportunities, right? We're underutilization of our services. So when it comes to active thinking, research advances and economic advances, coming up with innovative strategies to do things, and the services that are available to different communities, right? Having clinics and veterinarians and, a lot of these communities. To maximize access, we first have to acknowledge that there are some of these biases, that we all have them, and we have to work together with compassion, right? So diversifying our services, embracing diversity, increasing partnership through incremental care and through contextual care, understanding the different challenges that different populations face, right? And when it comes specifically to socioeconomics, we have to understand that this is a multifactorial and very complex issue, right? We have to consider the effect of socioeconomics not only on access to animal health, but not only in access to care for animals, but also in access to veterinary medicine as a career, and the cycle that creates, and how it can help us ultimately address veterinary deserts and different barriers. We have to use our privilege, right? You saw the wheel of privilege, and we have to use that to empower others. We have to educate ourselves. We have to mentor and increase those opportunities for others. Just because you have resources, though, it doesn't mean that you necessarily know better, like what some of these communities need. So avoid saviorism, or the idea that you can just bring in the new resources, the new initiatives into a community that potentially already knows all of the things that they need to thrive. One of my, I'm going the other way. One of my favorite quotes is from Emmett. And at first he was saying, with the chance I've been given, I'm going to be driven as hell. But toward the end, he says, with the chance you've been given, why are you not driven as hell? I think is all of our jobs to address this, to understand the socioeconomic challenges and how they work together with these geographic challenges, with the cultural competency challenges in order to be able to address and increase and improve access to care. In terms of some of the resources, there's an Access to Care hub. If you haven't seen it, I think a lot of you know a lot of these resources. I have another page, so I'll put it up in a minute. On the veterinarian side, we also have the AVMF REACH program and different organizations like Chapter 8 in Inclusive Vet and Vet Triage who are working hard to find ways to address care. So that's what I have in terms of slides. I didn't want to put in too many more slides regarding the musical toward the end because I really wanted to see, you know, have you seen it? Did you enjoy it? Did any of these things stand out for you? And do you see some of those parallels in how within all of the work that we do, socioeconomics is just there, right? We know that the majority of pet owners are struggling with finances, but are we seeing how the entirety of our teams is also struggling from that perspective? So
Thank you, Dr. McConnell. Those are amazing points to reference and to correlate, and I think exemplifying how complicated and how layered and intersexual all of these things are. The different difficulty, I think, for many people in animal welfare is finding this balance. You know, we have indifference, or we don't care about what's going on. You don't see what's going on. It doesn't affect you. And then the opposite is saviorism, right? That you have all the answers, you have the solutions, and you are there to rescue someone who, in your perception, doesn't have them. How do you have any self-awareness around saviorism versus empowerment, which is really the direction that you're looking for? How do we leverage our own privileges to use that to empower and not go towards that saviorism spectrum? I know that's a heavy question.
Trying to double check. There's a book. I'll be millisecond. So this is one of my favorite books. It's called Critical Mentoring by Tori Weiston Surdon. And in this book, you can see I have like all the little tabs for all of the places. Essentially, what she says is that we have to be able to understand the challenges of the different communities that we serve without believing that we are the best person to address those challenges, because individuals within those communities most likely already know how to address those challenges. They may just not have the resources to do that. She also talks about how when we mentor others, a lot of times we are thinking about helping them, you know, move to like a better place, if you will. So saying, oh, if once you become a, you know, a big shot lawyer, like you can practice in downtown Chicago, right? When perhaps this individual from Southside Chicago always dreamed of being able to support people in their communities. So we're biasing some of our mentees into believing, and there's nothing wrong with where people want, you know, to go and practice, obviously, but to a certain extent, we can be biasing individuals and bringing them into that mentality. So we need to be able to work with others and mentor others in a way that is the way that they want to be worked with. That's a convoluted sentence. Oh my gosh.
Right, that makes sense. It seems like such an easy answer, right? An easy perception, but it's very challenging, I think, as an individual to always have that introspection, to really look at what privileges do I carry? Because everyone has a privilege, everyone, like, but what they are and what spectrum and what situation that may show itself is quite different.
Yeah.
And
Carol Dweck, Dr. Carol Dweck actually wrote a book on on mindset, and she talked about growth mindset versus fixed mindset, and actually coined these terms in, I think it was 2006. And what she says is that individuals with a fixed mindset, when they're faced with a challenge, they're more likely to assume that they're just not good at that task. Whereas individuals that have a growth mindset are more likely to see an opportunity for growth. They may say more, I'm not good at this yet, right? And I think that's something that we in the animal health profession, like a lot of us have a fixed mindset to a certain extent, because at least from the data out there, perfectionism is very high and neuroticism is very high in animal health. So we're, the voice for the voiceless. And sometimes we want to do the absolute best that we can. And sometimes we don't consider that what we may see as, say, gold standard, may still not be, maybe too much, and that it's better to just receive some care than all care, if that makes sense.
Indeed, I think it's definitely a frame shift in your kind of mental capacity awareness in that situation. And I love that you bring up that growth mindset, that it has to be intentional when you're creating an awareness of yourself, awareness of the environment and the places that you work and the people you work with. You have to really be intentional, and you have to be accepting of failing at the same time, right? And not being successful right away, and using your accountability and tools to be able to do that in order for that greater outcome.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Miguel, do you have any questions or see anything you wanted to bring up as well?
Sorry.
Will my email be shared with people? Sorry, just.
Yeah, I don't have any questions, and I don't see any additional questions in the chat right now. Just love what both of you said about privilege and how, everybody has some in different ways. I can name off a bunch of different ways in which I am, in a minority, or I am part of an oppressed group. And also, I walk around perceived as a man on a daily basis, and that comes with its own privilege. So everybody has, something that they can bring with them, and to use to bring other folks up. So both of you, thank you for bringing that up.
Thanks. Looks like we have just a little bit of time for one more question. Lisa Norton's raise your hand.
Yep.
What do you have?
I love Carol Dweck. Thank you for bringing her up. So when thinking about listening to the communities, I have reached out to local rescues that are not 501c3, and I have obtained a 501c3 to talk about how we can work together and complement, and not duplicate, but fill gaps and work together to essentially prevent intake. So I've reached out to multiple groups around the community, and I have only heard back from one. And I know they're all run on rescue, they're run on volunteers that are doing things in their volunteer time on top of, probably their jobs and whatnot. But if there's any really good opening door questions or ways that you have started that conversation, because I've done it, I've been able to do it with groups that are more social worker focused, like the human component, but less so with the animal rescue component.
I would say there's a lot of layers to this, right? So a lot of the smaller organizations are so overwhelmed that at times it's it's very difficult to sit down and say, okay, this person is trying to reach out to me. And then you have to wonder, are they reaching out because they want to provide resources? I will say, as somebody who started a nonprofit, who had a lot of that at the beginning, when we first started in 2020, we had, I would say, maybe 5 calls a week with different groups that wanted to talk about how to partner together. And we had to stop taking those calls. And I'm not saying that this is how groups see you in your organization, but for us, at least, we had a lot of organizations that would call us to ask us for advice. or they would say, oh, we're just starting out and we would love it if you could help us figure out how to do, diversity and inclusion. And we were a tiny organization with no funding that was just getting off the ground. And my husband and I, who co-founded this nonprofit, we were doing this on our spare time. We've never gotten paid to do that. And when you're that overwhelmed and you're trying to do all of the work that your organization does, it is very difficult to open the door, because many a time when you've done it, maybe not much has come of it and it feels like you've wasted some of those resources. Now, I can't speak for all of those, but that's how sometimes I see it. And so being able to create a relationship where it's like clear that whatever partnership you have is not actually going to or decrease the resources or the limited resources that those organizations already have, may be the way to go. Because a lot of times what may seem to you as a partnership that is mutually beneficial may seem to that organization as something that they just don't have the time for.
It sounds like it's one of those things that, again, that conversation and being authentic, vulnerable, and transparent can really make a big difference. Well, I can't thank you enough for joining us today, and we can continue the conversation on Maddie's forum. If you've got any additional questions, we can see you there. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next Monday.
Thank you.